And here he is in the flesh, Richard Barton. Good morning, Richard.
Good morning, Keith. You have the advantage of me this morning because, as you may know, there's a rail strike, and I'm therefore going to be conducting my case from home today.
Oh, yeah. I didn't know that. I'd forgotten there was a rail strike, actually. They come so frequently now that you tend to not pay too much attention. Very naughty.
No, but very nice judge who's said that I can appear from here. I will take my jumper off before I put the wig on. I thought it would be something of interest, just you as a journalist, me as a lawyer, to talk about the recent Donald Trump case in America, where he has been ordered to pay $5 million compensation in a civil case. Now, I don't particularly want to express any views on Donald Trump generally. You may wish to. I don't know. But it does highlight the
I started
differences between albeit we share a common law system, the United States and the UK.
Barrister,
England and Wales.
And then at 8 o'clock, I did a show with both barristers.
I'll talk about it.
And then I
Scotland. But
did a truncated version of our papers. And then I did the show with Melissa and her witch author.
Odd. I'll be absolutely honest.
From New York. And then I did another one with
first thing about this case is it was a civil
money
claim.
Expert from the Financial Times.
It wasn't a criminal case.
Well,
so this was
I've now got to
the complainant
distribute them properly, or
suing him.
So I'm sitting here doing that.
Or, well, she sued him for rape, sexual assault, and defamation.
You're not okay.
It wasn't a case brought by the state or the federal authorities.
Yeah.
With a criminal sanction. So in other words, he was never going to go to prison as a consequence of this. It was always going to be simply a financial remedy that would be available to her. Now, as you may know, in this country, somebody in her position, if this were a criminal case, that person would be entitled to complete anonymity for the rest of their life, whether or not the claim is found to be true or not. So it would be a contempt of court. To name somebody who, in this country, in a criminal court, has been a complainant in a sexual case, but she. In America, it's just all over the press, as we can see. And he was ultimately found to have sexually assaulted her and then defamed her. But the allegation of rape wasn't found to be proven. But here's the odd feature of the American
Jesus, that's frightening.
To me, anyway, is that this is a civil claim. So, as I say, there's no criminal sanction.
That's frightening.
And they have a jury deciding it. And we used to have jurors deciding civil cases in different ways many years ago, but we got rid of them. But in America, they do, and it makes a very big difference to possible outcomes, as you can imagine. um, but because jurors can be swayed by factors other than um, what they see before them. But that's what they do there. For example, I don't know if you remember, Keith, but let me take it back. Most civil cases in this country have not had juries for many years, and there have been a few exceptions. Certainly, when I first started practicing. So, for example, if it was a civil action against the police, in other words, I'm saying I'm suing the police because they beat me up. Very often you'd have a jury there. Different number of jurors, oddly enough. And I did do a couple of those when they still had jurors dealing with them. And the other area where there would be, when I first started, jurors on a civil case were defamation cases. Now, you probably know the actor Lawrence Fox.
Mm-hmm.
He was in whatever that Morse follow-on thing was. I can't remember what it was called.
Yeah, Lewis.
Lewis, exactly. In fact, oddly enough, the chap who played Lewis used to, I think he had family who he'd visited here in Lewis. And occasionally I'd see him, and I encouraged my young daughters, who were very small at that time. I'd say, "Where are we?" And they'd shout out, "Lewis!" And oddly enough, sorry, I digress so much, but maybe not completely. When I was in my graduate year, I did a master's at Oxford. I shared a flat with a bloke who was he used to get £25 a day to go and be an extra in Morse. So it's not a program I would normally watch, but occasionally they rerun things, and I'd say, "Oh, look, there's Simon. He's drinking the pint of beer in the back of the pub, or he's doing up the body bag, or whatever it might be." I can't bear watching Morse though, because I end up saying, "You can't drive from there to there in that way. No, this is." Anyway, sorry, I digress. But Lawrence Fox, who played Hathaway, that's the name of the character, wasn't it? Hathaway.
Yes, that's right.
And Lawrence Fox has become a slightly controversial character for his political views on a whole range of things. And last year, he tried to say, "Look, I've got a defamation case. I want to have a jury." And in fact, I hadn't appreciated this because it's not an area of work that I do. There hasn't been a jury in a defamation case in this country for the last 10 years. And he was refused. So there's a very major difference there between what we do and what the Americans do.
But he could make the request, could he?
He made the request, but he was knocked back on it. And I don't really know in what circumstances, given that nowadays, that a court would permit somebody, would say, yes, this case needs a jury. I suppose if it was somebody who was very high profile against somebody else who was very high profile, or there was some sensitivity to it, then perhaps you might. But it seems to me that that ship has sailed as far as we're concerned. Whereas in America, anything can happen. And it's one of the reasons why in America they often have ludicrous amounts of damages. I'm not saying it's ludicrous in this case at all, quite the contrary. But you do hear of these cases in America where the jury get to decide how much, what the level of damages ought to be, and it's off the scale. It's a silly amount of money. We don't have that here. You can still get a decent payout. And here's an odd little feature of it, which is I used to teach law a bit, and I used to say to my students, if you knocked me down with your car and injured me quite badly, but then got out and said, it's your own fault, you idiot, because of whatever, which wasn't true, I get better damages for what you said about me as opposed to what you did to me. And that is true in this country. And I think it's one of the reasons why why they've got rid of juries for defamation in this country, because some of the awards of damages were ludicrously high. But that's an interesting point about the Trump case, to see a jury doing it. Now, one other thing that I think is very interesting, and this may be a lawyer's point, but it doesn't make it any worse, even if it is a lawyer's point, is that he's come out publicly and said, I'm going to appeal. I'm definitely going to appeal. And said various other things about the complainant. Now, there's two things there. He needs to be awfully careful because if he defames her further in the same way, it's an absolute shoo-in that she will get more damages from him, because it's been decided that she was making a true complaint about him in that respect. So I don't know who's advising him, if anybody, and it may well be that those who advise him have no chance to control the matter. But the other interesting lawyer's point is this. The court found that she had been sexually assaulted and had been defamed, but they rejected the allegation that she'd been raped by him. Now, that's quite important from the point of view of an appeal, which he's talking about. Because if I prosecute a case and I've got a 7-8 count indictment, I quite like a jury to acquit on one of the accounts and find not guilty on that, because it illustrates the fact that they have listened to the evidence and it's not been a knee-jerk reaction on their part. They've not just decided across the board everything's wrong. In other words, it gives you an advantage in defending any appeal, and her lawyers will have the same advantage. They'll be able to say, well, this jury weren't biased against him. They weren't just taking a view without reference to the evidence, because they obviously did consider the evidence quite carefully, and they decided that whilst he had done this and this, two things, we decide he hadn't done the other. So I know it's a bit odd to say, and it may well be that she's disappointed by the finding against her in relation to the rape allegation. But if I were representing her, I'd be saying that's, oddly enough, awfully good news, because it gives us a very clear point against any possible appeal. Now, in this country, appeals from jury decisions are incredibly difficult to pursue. You have to show. Normally, it would be because a jury had been misdirected in law, something like that. I don't think that's happened in this case. But to actually go into the jury's decision-making process is just not permitted. And so, if you want to go into that, if you want to, as it were, go into the jury retirement room and ask them to tell you what happened, you need to get permission from the Court of Appeal to get statements from them, because a jury are told in the very strictest terms that whilst at the end of the case they can talk about what's happened in court, they must never to anybody talk about what happens in their retirement room when they are deciding on the case. It's a good rule, obviously, and very sensible. So if he wants to say that in some way the jury have done something wrong in that way, he's going to have to get permission from the appellate court, the appeal court there, to have lawyers approach jurors and take statements from them. But it's very, very rare that that actually happens. There was a case many years ago when I was tiny. I might have still been wearing shorts, but I was certainly a barrister by then. Where there was a hitman murder in Kent of what was in fact quite a notorious local. He'd like to think of himself as a gangster, I'm sure. And I know quite a bit about the case because a member of my chambers, much more senior than me at that time, obviously, represented that particular person, the person who died, in various other things as well. So, but back in the day, jurors would have to keep together until they've made their decisions. And so it doesn't happen anymore. I've got a jury going out today. If come 4 o'clock today they haven't reached a decision, then they're given various directions about not being in contact with each other, not discussing it, come back again on Monday. Very sensible. But 20 years ago, 25 years ago, jurors were in fact put in a hotel overnight if they hadn't reached a decision, and kept together, not in the same room. That would be a bit weird, but they were kept away from everybody. And what happened in that particular hitman case, shot through the head, was that the jury back in their hotel that they'd been given for the night, some of them decided that the correct way of deciding the truth of the case was to get out a Ouija board and try and talk to the deceased to find out where the truth lay. There was then a conviction, but then, and I don't know how it happened, but it came out that in fact the jurors had done this. So that's the extreme example of where you might be allowed to talk to jurors, and the conviction got overturned, albeit there was then a retrial with a conviction relating to it. So I'm not quite sure what our friend Donald is going to do about this. He talks about an appeal, but I think legally he's on quite shaky ground on that. Now, what's your view on this as a journalist, Keith?
Well, I was going to ask you because I have a deep unease as a journalist is the modern practice of judging something in 2023 that happened in 1980 or 1990 or whatever, when the environment, circumstances, mores were very different. It bothers me enormously. Now, I'm no fan of Trump, believe me, but the fact that this happened in 1990 and it's now being found a decision on it in 2023, to me, to use one of your terms, is I would not feel that the judgment was safe.
It makes the cases more difficult. You know, there was a change in the law in America, which is the only reason this woman was able to bring this case, and we don't have in this country, certainly within criminal proceedings, what's called a statute of limitation, and what that means is that there's a specific time limit within which you can bring a case. Some civil cases in this country have a limitation of 3 years, some have 6 years. But for criminal cases, there is no limitation of time. And I've certainly done cases involving offences that were frankly committed at around the time I was born, not committed against me or by me, come to think of it. I would have been too young to be criminally liable. There's an interesting point on that, actually, because the law got changed. There used to be a thing called dolly incapax. That's a silly Latin phrase where you couldn't be criminally liable if you're under 10, but if you were older than that, up to 13, 14, then you could say, I didn't realize effectively what I was doing was criminal because I'm a naive little lad, whatever it might be. And it was called the dolly incapax rule. And they've got rid of that, which is a shame. I used to have a lot of fun with that. I had a little lad in the Medway towns who was a one lad criminal crime wave. He set a light to somebody. He stole lots of things. This is the nicest thing he did. Well, not the nicest, but the cleverest thing he did. He went into a bank, managed somehow to get in through into the staff area, and he stole the staff's purses and wallets. And the bank, of course, were deeply embarrassed by this because it didn't say much for their security. I see what you mean, Keith, but the other side of it is that sometimes, and I'm not talking about the Trump case anymore, I'm just talking generally, but cases that I've dealt with in this country criminally, often complainants don't feel able to say what's happened to them for many years. And it may well be that there's something's changed in their life and then they're able to come forward. Of course, it makes it more difficult. A judge will direct a jury to say, you just need to bear in mind that there's been this delay and you mustn't hold that against the defendant. It's not the defendant's fault. And in fact, bear it in mind when it comes to the defendant's ability to collate their evidence and remember and give their evidence. But, I've called, I remember one case in particular, I've called men of my age, 26, whatever age I have, and who have been in the witness box and just cried about things that happened to them when they were 7, 8, 9, at a prep school. So I do understand your point, and I can see the difficulties it can entail. And in fact, my father, bless him, no longer with us, he would have agreed with you entirely. He thought that there should be some kind of limitation. And I had a similar conversation with him about it. So, you know, ultimately, it's a question of justice. And if somebody is for example, a sex offender, it's important that they never feel safe from the long arm of the law, from justice coming and finding them.
Yeah. But for instance, in this industry, as I can remember that in the 1950s and the 1960s, it wouldn't be beyond you to walk into a newsroom and see a female employee and pat her bottom. To be judged on that behaviour now seems to me to be very unjust.
Keith, you do not have to say anything, but it may harm your defence if you fail to mention when questioned something which you later relied in court, and anything you do say may be given against you. Those are the words of the caution, by the way, which are... at some stage, Keith, perhaps I could get my 3 daughters to come and have a conversation with you about your views on that, because they're very clear about it. And
well, I'm not saying that I would accept it now, but what I'm saying is that doing it back then and to be judged on it now, that makes me uneasy.
It's a different call, isn't it? I can sort of see what you mean, but the fact that it was considered acceptable at the time doesn't mean it was right. And so, you know, mercifully, we live in more enlightened times.
Yeah.
But
we will have a debate on this, because it really does. It's a very good point. Is it right at the time? Why does that make it wrong 20 or 30 years later? But we're actually running out of time. And what I would like to do is to just ask you one very, very quick thing.
Yep.
Is going back to, say, the Profumo case, is his career was shattered and so on, although he meticulously rebuilt it. But it would appear that Trump in the United States with this isn't suffering one little bit. What's your view legally on that?
Well, that's up to the Americans, isn't it? They voted him in once, which I remember when Reagan was the president, and I thought, good grief, this man is mad. But in fact, he ended up as a bit of a sort of statesman in comparison to Trump. I suppose there are 2 things. Firstly, it doesn't probably ultimately affect his run to become the candidate, because he's got a caucus of supporters who will follow him almost come what may. But I think it will damage him in terms of the possibility of re-election, because I think there will be an increasing number of Americans who will consider that he's frankly crossed the line. Now, I suppose there's an interplay there, isn't there? Whether there are enough Republicans who think he's not going to get in, we're not going to get the votes that we need from that sort of floating vote lot, not the dyed-in-the-wool Democrats, not the Republicans, that they might say, sorry, we're not going to have you. But no, I agree. You know, within his own party, I think they just don't believe it. I thought it was very interesting, that interview that he had where he was frankly rude to the person interviewing him and repeated a lot of lies. But there we go.
Richard, it's exactly 30 minutes now, so I'm going to say toodle pip for this. And
Lovely.
in a few minutes, hopefully, we'll be back with Philip.
Lovely.
So I'm going to ask you to log in again, but just watch your screen in the next 5 minutes.
Will do. Thank you, Keith. Lovely.
Okay, and thank you.